Good afternoon. This is Safe and Safe Country podcast, and me, author and host Alina Frolova. Just to remind you that in this podcast, we're speaking about security and defense in our quite difficult time. We're speaking about physical security, about conventional war, about how the war has modernized, what we need to do to win this war for Europe and for the world, how to stabilize the situation, and whether it's possible. This podcast is produced jointly by the Center of Defense Strategies, Ukrainska Pravda, and Media Center Ukraine. You can find us on all the resources of Ukrainska Pravda, as well as on largest podcast platforms Apple, Google, Spotify, SoundCloud, and other. Don't forget to subscribe to receive updates. And for many years before this conventional war, which happened in Ukraine now, and which we also observe in Israel now, the world and the experts were discussing that the next war would be quite hybrid. And saying about hybrid, mainly experts were focusing on informational and propaganda issues. And my guest for today is the person who is quite digging in propaganda and disinformation issues. This is Pekka Kallioniemi. He's a researcher, PhD student working in the field of human-computer interaction at University of Tampere, social media expert. He studies how propaganda spreads on social media and how to counter it. He also is the founder of Vatnik, a social media project aimed at identifying super distributors of Russian propaganda in the West. Pekka, good afternoon.
Hello, good to be here. May I do a little correction there? So I actually finished my PhD in 2018, so I'm a postdoctoral researcher.
Oh, great. My congratulations.
Thank you.
I know how much it takes to make it. Pekka, I saw you actually with this Vatnik Soup on Twitter. I started to follow you and subscribe on this, and I somehow understood that there is not so much analysis, like a quick analysis of the issues which you take into account, how the network of disinformation is distributed, how the influence and opinion leaders got into this influence. So first of all, maybe you will explain to our English-speaking audience what is Vatnik and why this is the Vatnik soup.
My definition, and I think it's a general definition for Vatnik, is somebody who promotes and or spreads pro-Kremlin propaganda. So basically any narratives coming from Kremlin. So people, if they support it and or spread it, then I consider them a Vatnik. And that's Vatnik Soup is the name of the series. And it kind of introduces these people whom I consider Vatniks, but also the narratives and the mechanisms behind the spreading of these topics and narratives. So that's the project.
Okay, so these are threads series which are you posting quite each day almost. Yes, you do quite a good analysis. And you have more than 200,000 subscribers. And this is a big one for a researcher. Is this a rise of subscriptions for your page and Twitter because of Vatnik Soup, because of public work you're doing, or it was just before the war started, a full-scale invasion?
So I actually created the account after the full-scale invasion started. So my history as a social media researcher is I've been extremely critical of social media in how it kind of polarizes populations and how it's often used for basically harm. So I've been a harsh critic of the big platforms like Facebook and Instagram and Twitter nowadays also. But then I thought that maybe because I kind of know the landscape, maybe I could do something in that information space. So I created my Twitter account. I think it was in April 2022, so sometime after the war. And for maybe 6 months, I was basically, nobody cared what I said or what I tweeted. And then I posted the first version of prototype of the Vatnik Soup, and it immediately became quite popular. And then I started doing them almost on a daily basis and basically just kept growing. But when I published my first soup, I had 80 followers. So it definitely wasn't a very big account. And you can say that Vatnik Soup made the account big.
Does it mean that people try to find the relevant information and some kind of to find the truth that they are following this, that they are interested in? Who are your subscribers there?
It's just regular people who support Ukraine mostly. That would probably be the biggest audience. And I feel like there was a need for this. I felt like there wasn't enough discussion about who these so-called super spreaders of disinformation are and what are the main narratives coming out of the Kremlin. Because to me, it felt like I had the same conversations over and over again. It was always the same topics and with always the same people. So the dissemination of these topics and introduction of these people, I felt like it needed to be done. And now we can clearly see that there was a need for this kind of approach and research.
Yeah, about the super spreaders of information. Yes, let's take one of the cases which you described not so long ago, Elon Musk. And I just checked today, it has more than 37 million of coverage in Twitter. And that's like incredible figures. How you identify these super spreaders, how you see the narratives, how you work with them. And maybe you will tell an example of Elon Musk, which everyone knows. And in Ukraine, this is quite a big topic.
So yeah, first of all, Elon Musk, of course, his company SpaceX helped Ukraine a lot when they enabled Starlink in Ukraine and sent these terminals there. So that was actually, I've heard from many Ukrainians, maybe you can kind of confirm, but it was a big deal at the beginning of the war. So people could still stay in contact with each other and so on. But since then, Elon Musk has been quite controversial in what he has said, and he's basically, somebody put it well that it's like watching a radicalization of a person in real time, because it's been getting worse and worse and worse in terms of what Elon Musk promotes on X/Twitter. And if you kind of follow that path, at some point, some of the messages became quite pro-Kremlin, anti-Ukraine, in my view, and I think most people would agree there. Also, the changes that he has made for the platform has made the spread of disinformation and Kremlin propaganda a lot easier, and it spreads much faster. So it works on this multiple levels. So apparently he believes these narratives, but he's also made it easier for other super spreaders to spread these messages. And then again, he promotes and shares these views too. So I feel like it's a very damaging combination of factors when it comes to Elon Musk. But basically, I think probably the best known example of Elon Musk sharing the pro-Kremlin views was when he shared a meme of President Zelensky. Maybe some people have already seen it, like basically about him asking for more money, which is the meme kind of shows in a negative way. But I would say that at this point, it is quite clear that Elon Musk could be categorized as a vatnik.
And you just said a very interesting thing, that it's like you observing the transformation of the person online. Yes, you're just like watching like a show from the person who was actively pro-Ukrainian, let's say so, to actively, he considered it to be some kind of balanced, but we see that this is a very transforming narrative which Russia is distributing. And yesterday, for example, he just made this comment that Ukraine should agree on losing part of the territory because everyone needs peace, and he was promoting this very hardly. And why can such people as Elon Musk be under such a big influence of Russian propaganda? How Russians reaching these persons, how they make them to transform? What is the key which you see here?
So, of course, we don't know what's going on, like communications-wise, who he talks to and who's in his so-called war room, who he discuss with over these matters. But I feel like it might not even coming directly from the Kremlin, this kind of, it just could be kind of the effect of social media, how it reinforces our ideas when we see specific content tailored to us. So there's this information bubble. And once you enter the information bubble that has conspiracy theories or similar, then you tend to also get some point to these Kremlin narratives because they are very strongly connected to several conspiracy theories. But yeah, in case of Elon Musk, it's very difficult to say where the motivation to spread this kind of message is coming, Basically, it came almost out of the blue. I would say that the first controversial thing that Elon Musk shared was the so-called peace plan for Ukraine, which was ridiculously damaging for Ukraine. It would have been a horrible solution. And we now know the peace plan probably came from his associate, David Sachs, who wrote it a couple of weeks before that op-ed. But still, it's something that Elon Musk thought that it's a good idea and he shared it. So that's probably that's like the turning point where we can see something changed. Because maybe a few months before that, he was tweeting like he is extremely pro-Ukraine and wants Ukraine to win, but then something like snapped and changed.
And if to make readback of narratives which Russia and readback of the approaches which Russia used for all this period, how it develops, what are the main trends which you saw, which you see now, what changes, does they make a change of the tactics? And how we can see this, how we can observe these tactics in the social media?
Well, it works on many levels. I mean, I would say that for many years, there has been maybe 3-4 main narratives. NATO expansion, probably the biggest one, relying on Mersheimer's speeches and lectures and so on. And then the genocide in Donbass narrative, a lie that there's been genocide going on in Donbass for 8-9 years, conducted by the Ukrainians, which is of course not true. At some point, they were trying to push the bioweapons lab thing at the beginning of the war, but that has since faded. Now, I would say that the third biggest thing is the corruption in Ukraine, which they kind of try to emphasize to affect the military and humanitarian aid. So basically what they're trying to say that the leaders, the regime in Ukraine is so-called Kiev regime is corrupt and they are just laundering money for global elites and so on, and everything you send to Ukraine, weapons, humanitarian aid, it will be sold somewhere else. So that's what they tried after the Hamas attack. So they allegedly used some of the trophy weapons that captured from the Ukrainian soldiers as proof that Ukraine has sent weapons and arms to help Hamas, a terrorist group, which is, of course, is not true. But they are constantly trying to promote this level of corruption in Ukraine. And I feel like it's probably at the moment, it's the most effective method that they are using.
Are you in analysis now of Israeli situation, or you just focused on Ukrainian part of the war?
So I focus on disinformation. So all disinformation and fake news and photo manipulations, video manipulations, I also analyze, not of course all the content because there's an infinite amount of that, but some of the key content I also analyze, and I try to stay also on top of that because they use similar strategies that have been used in Ukraine, mainly using old video content or photo content to kind of create strong emotional reactions. So that's basically what we've seen, especially during the first 10 days or so of the war. There was a lot of content coming from Syria, from previous conflicts. And the same thing we saw at the beginning of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, February.
Does it mean that all the other actors started to use these tactics, or we can say that this is mainly Russian presence in this influence?
Everybody's using the same approach now. So, I mean, well, not everybody, but there are many parties. I don't usually talk about American propaganda or how they work, but it's basically ubiquitous. It's everywhere. It's Hollywood, it's Coca-Cola, it's freedom, it's democracy, this kind of stuff that they're selling, which is basically the Western style of living, freedom, probably at the epicenter, whereas Russian style is more about high volume disinformation that is trying to make the other party look bad. So that's the difference. But yeah, now, for example, China uses Russia's strategies because it's so effective. Iran has been using it for a long time. Hamas is now using it. And all kind of parties who support Palestine and Hamas, they are strongly using these strategies now. So it's spreading definitely because it's so effective. And of course, we have to say that Donald Trump's team has also utilized these strategies quite effectively.
Does it mean that these disinformation tactics now became the everyday life experience of each of us? I mean, that world really changed. And is these changes are so stable that we will live with this forever? What's your prognosis?
I would say that yes and no. It depends on how much time you spend online and on social media. That's not necessary for anybody to actually be there. So I think what people should do more is maybe spend less time on social media and on these like immediate events, breaking news, breaking events, and maybe spend time more in, I don't know, with your family in the nature. This has been my main message for years. And also give news some time to kind of clear up. So one example, so perhaps you remember those air defense missiles that landed in Poland. So it took people about 1 minute to already say that this is Russia's missile and it's article number 5 without doing any proper research. So this is something that I've always said, like, if you wait maybe 10 hours or something, like do some kind of investigation first and wait for the actual news to kind of clear up, then we would have less this kind of strong emotional reactions and it would affect us in a positive way, in my view. But on social media, everything happens constantly and everything is immediate. We are always looking for breaking news and people share these news without actually doing any kind of fact checking or research. And that's extremely dangerous.
We just spoke with my colleagues about this, that analyzing the last events which happening all around. I mean, Israel with quite a populistic government leading the country and the influence which this populism now has on the life of usual people. Trump in America, all this like a show with the election of a new speaker from Republicans. Few results of the European elections here already, which happened. I'm speaking about Slovak elections and Switzerland, where also the quite populistic party won the election campaign, actually. Can we say that because of the populism, disinformation is so popular, or this is disinformation which led to the popularity of populism in politics, when you just like play with information, switch it, say not true and have no responsibility? Where is the source of all these problems?
I would say that it works both ways, so they both affect each other. But I think the biggest problem here is what you already said, is the lack of responsibility of your words. Basically, you can say these days, Donald Trump is the embodiment of lying without consequences. You can say basically anything and you can become the president of the United States. And that's incredible in my view, because there is no accountability to your words. You can say whatever you want during your campaign. And even after you're president, you can say a lot of silly things and it just raises your popularity. So that's the biggest problem right now. And to be honest, I don't know what's the solution for that. But we need solutions. I mean, for me, I'm not against populism in politics. I mean, it can be like directly addressing people, regular people. It can be a good way to campaign. But I mean, it should be based on truth and it should be based on accountability and responsibility behind your words. So.
And coming back to the election issue, there were also many discussions how disinformation and how social media influence actually on the election results. There is only one case which was well investigated, and it was Cambridge Analytica. And there are a lot of researches about how they influence the election. There were some cases during Macron campaign, which were not so public, but which were demonstrated. But can we really prove that social media and disinformation has substantial influence? And do you see that Russians are focusing, for example, on the next elections, which would be in Europe, and where almost in each country we have a threat of coming of pro-Russian politicians, or this is opportunistic forces to power?
Yeah, I think the case of Cambridge Analytica is quite different from basically what we have today, because during that time, Facebook provided easy access to almost all of their data. So companies like Cambridge Analytica, they could actually just pay for the data, and it would be massive amounts of like hundreds of millions of data points that they could then like branch or categorize and put into clusters. And then they basically utilized psychology and behavioral sciences to that and tried to affect those small clusters So, because you don't have to convince everybody, you just have to convince the key people. For example, in US election, you just have to win like these so-called, what's the word? Well, these states that can go either way, can go Republican or Democrat. So you have to win there and you have to come up with the plan to kind of be more popular in that segment. And that's what Cambridge Analytica did very effectively. But in addition, they also, the whole election was a target of very large hybrid warfare project coming from the Kremlin. So basically, they poured a lot of money to that election, and it worked on many levels. On social media, of course, it's information operations and the information war in there, but also on other levels like lobbying and this kind of stuff. So they poured a lot of money into that. And of course, Cambridge Analytica has been also been connected to Russia. But people usually, when they say that, when they talk about so-called Russiagate, that Russia didn't really, it was just some social media posts and memes and so on what they did. But that's not true. They did a lot of things on different levels, which make this strategy of hybrid warfare. So it works on multiple levels. And when you add those together, you get the actual effect.
And what is interesting, actually, the concept of these active measures or insurgency, which Soviet Union was using, it's actually moved to the concept of this hybrid warfare, where just instruments were changed, but the goals and approach is to how to destroy the enemy, how to destroy the democracy, they stay the same. And if we will read the materials from 1970s, for example, we will see the same line of effect they tried to reach KGB and Soviet Union. But it was quite slow. Now with social media, everything is much faster. And probably that's why we see this shaking democracy principles now in Europe, which is quite a dangerous situation as for me. But saying not only about Europe, Russia also make an influence on other parts of the world, like African, Asian countries. They have their presence almost in each conflict, which is like starting up on this earth. Do you see some specifics in different regions which they use? Do you see some different goals and approaches which Russians are using, for example, for Africa, for Asia, and for European markets?
Well, yeah, Africa is a good example because basically, for example, PMC Wagner has a strong presence. They have a strong military presence in Africa, and they've taken over cobalt mines and this kind of like industry. They pour money into these industries and then they kind of gain control of them. But it's also a lot about information operations, propaganda. So, for example, China and Russia, they collaborate in many African countries. So China offers the infrastructure for Russian media to kind of dominate there. So, for example, Sputnik is very, very big in many African countries, and they dominate the information space. Probably also partly due to the kind of the history of colonization coming from the Western countries. So many African countries feel like Russia in many ways could be even the savior of this. So many African countries are still extremely bitter to France, so these colonizing countries. So there's also the history part. But yeah, so what Russia does, they have very strong military presence in African countries, but they also dominate the media space in various countries. So that's, again, a hybrid warfare approach, and it's working. And yeah, China has been collaborating. Of course, China also has a strong presence in Africa. So that's basically how they're working in Africa. And of course, other countries in South America, RT is quite big media. And I mean, Asia is kind of a blind spot for me. I would like to do more research on that, but probably there are some. India, for example, their Russian propaganda is quite effective in India.
Speaking about the automation of all this, like disinformation campaigns and daily disinformation approaches. A few years ago, everyone was speaking about bots, trolls, and so on. From now on, what we observe here in Ukrainian, for example, space, this is less bot usage, more this is like a usual people, but that's usually well-organized groups of people who are trying to promote something. What you see in global manner is this: we are moving to automation, we are moving out of automation. Are the bots still a power, and how all this operates now? What is specific?
The automation is coming strongly on many platforms. For example, on TikTok, there's quite a bit of automized so-called speaking head propaganda where you don't have actual people talking, and then it shows some kind of propaganda. So TikTok is strongly dominated by Russian propaganda. No surprises there. And it's still kind of a blind spot to many. We like to talk a lot about X/Twitter, but we kind of forget TikTok because it's huge, especially among the young people. But sorry, I forgot the question. I lost my train of thought. Sorry.
Bots, automation.
Yeah, sorry. Yes. So, I agree with the sentiment that it's mostly driven by humans at this point because humans can make these little nuances, and it's more nuanced, the discussion that they can create, even though it's like this factory work, almost like mass production of propaganda. And I've seen some of the exposés that Ukrainian authorities have done on these troll farms with the 10,000 SIM cards and so on. So you have this mass creation of accounts that then are used to spread propaganda. But the automation it's coming, and it's something that all Western countries, including Ukraine, should prepare for. Probably many states are preparing also already for that, but it needs to be understood how effective it can be when you can automize everything and still make it seem like it's organic, it's grassroots, and it seems real. It seems like it's done by humans. So if you have video, if you have photos, and if you have text combined, this multimedia propaganda model, it's going to be very difficult to distinguish what's real and what's not.
TikTok is a really interesting issue because I didn't see, probably know any research about the TikTok and its use for propaganda. Obviously, it should be, but maybe you will tell a little bit more about the specifics of this TikTok and how it is used. What is like a difference between all the other social media?
Okay, first of all, I think the first thing should be mentioned is TikTok is a Chinese company, and there is a strong espionage law in China that the government officials can access any data on TikTok. I think that's the reason why nobody should use TikTok. Of course, you can share whatever you want, but I just don't suggest anyone using TikTok to do anything because first of all, they collect a massive amount of data from your phone or whatever you use for it. And then you don't know where the data goes. It's a black box. And so that's my general view on TikTok. It's a dangerous tool which can be used for espionage, but also it's very well made. It has an incredibly good algorithm that provides you content that will keep you engaged for a long time. And like most algorithms, they will feed you content that engages you and that you're interested in. And it's very good at guessing what you're interested in. And if you start watching war propaganda, you will be extremely engaged because you have endless amount of so, for example, if you are pro-Russian, it can provide you endless amount of pro-Russian propaganda, or vice versa. If you're pro-Ukraine, it's the same. But the style is different, of course. But still, it's a dangerous tool that's not being looked into enough. It's a blind spot for most disinformation researchers. And state security in general, it's a big threat.
Let's try to speak about how to counter disinformation, yes. And we see some examples when the government, for example, tries to enter this fight. We know about this East Stratcom task force, for example, in European Union, which was created just to really debunk the disinformation. We see, for example, networking approach like NAFO in Twitter, yes, which became quite visible and quite influential network which tried to debunk the disinformation. But does it really matter? Is this effective approach? And what could be used by government, by people, by usual people to understand and debunk it and some kind of to protect themselves?
Okay, so first of all, I would divide this kind of debunking or countering process into long-term and short-term solutions. And Playfo is a short-term solution because it works immediately. And it's effective against Russian style of this high-volume propaganda because it's a similar approach. And what it does, it ridicules the messenger. So, for example, you have a Russian embassy tweeting something that's probably not true. And immediately, NAFO accounts, activists start ridiculing the account for this probable disinformation. So it's this immediate effect. And this is how the Russian model has always worked. So it's immediate. It tries to create this strong emotional reaction at the time when you receive the information. But then there's the long-term approach where you try to debunk, where you try to fact check these statements, these narratives, which is what I do, for example. So I look into the fire in Odessa or revolution of dignity, like specific things and what actually happened and theorize on that. But others do it well also. But it's like there's a lot of fact-checking organizations in the EU. So we have short-term and long-term solutions. But ideally, you would debunk every claim. It's not possible, but like the main narrative should be debunked. And then people should be informed that this is not actually not true. This is what, like, you can inform people about it. But when it comes to automation, the way to fight automation is to make automation. So you make counter automation. So it's like basically warfare in the field. So you have some new technology that is very effective, like Bayraktars at the beginning of the war. But you don't see them anymore because the Russians came up with a counter to Bayraktars with their anti-air, air defense. So basically, it's this constant battle between better automation and then you come up with. So, for example, if you use AI to create deepfake videos, then you have to create AI to detect is it a deepfake video or not? And then these algorithms have to, like, they are always competing each other. But to fight automation, you need automation. Humans cannot do it. It's too much work.
Especially about AI. Do you see that AI is taking more and more role in social media, in disinformation, or this is just the technique or technology which is not very actively used? Because it's not so easy to understand like a presence of AI in there and maybe automation of the process.
I think it's being utilized, but it's not very effective at this point. It's not on a massive scale yet. I think it's being tested. Like in a battlefield, you test new technology. I think it's being done right now, but maybe some of it seems too obvious. We have bots tweeting lines of code and this kind of stuff. So apparently it's not working very well, but it's being tested. It's there, but it doesn't have a big impact yet. So still, I would say that the most effective disinformation campaigning comes from the super spreader accounts, which are controlled, usually used by humans. Very popular accounts like Jackson Hinkle, Anastasia Lupis, Elon Musk. Then it's just humans tweeting and they have a massive following who then spread these messages. So it's still like this very traditional, and the disinformation is still also quite basic level. So it's usually posting images that are out of the context. So in case of Israel-Hamas conflict, posting images from Syria, for example, from 2014 after the chemical attack. So this is still basically the main way of doing propaganda. It's the automation. It's like bubbling under. It's maybe increasing in numbers a little bit, but it's still far away from dominating the social media space.
Speaking about influence of propaganda, here in Ukraine, we usually, of course, focus our attention on Russians. And we see that the population there is completely under the influence. We don't see any attempts of Russian population, Russian nation, like a political nation, to some kind of change the situation and to influence on the situation. And we see that in many cases, for example, like with Elon Musk, Russia reproduce all these reportages about his tweets, mostly for their internal population, to demonstrate that there are like those on the West, like Donald Trump, Elon Musk, who are in line with the ideas of Russians. But do you see some difference in how Russia influenced their own population? And do you see any ways in the future how to unfreeze the Russian population, how to take out this influence of the strong propaganda from their minds?
Okay, so Russia has this very strong censorship organization, Roskomnadzor, that basically can block any website. For example, Instagram is still blocked in Russia. So you need a VPN, virtual private network application, to access Instagram. And incidentally, the most downloaded apps for phones in Russia are VPNs, almost like top 10 is almost it's like free VPNs that they can access these sites. So even though Roskomnadzor is quite effective in what they do, there are still a lot of ways to kind of circumvent the censorship in Russia. And the popularity of these apps, it shows that especially probably young people do it a lot. But still, we have to remember that big part of the Russian population relies on television, especially the older people and people in the poor areas where usually the soldiers are also mobilized from. They rely on television, and it's under full control of the Kremlin and Roskomnadzor. So basically, everything you see on television in Russia is war propaganda, and it works. So I don't really see a good or easy way to affect this mentality of the population. There are a lot of theories. I'm not an expert on this, but some have theorized that once the living standards go low enough, like once they drop enough, then there might be something. But we've seen in Russia's history that this rarely happens. Unfortunately, people don't really rise up. And so I feel like there is a really strong support for Putin's regime still, and it's very difficult to kind of shake this or try to overthrow him and his cronies.
Yeah, unfortunately, even without social media, it was the historical path of Russia. And we also, like speaking here with the experts, we also can find some trends or ways of how to transform it to more democratic society, how to find the way. But many governments, and I saw this transformation, how like from 2014, many European governments were criticizing Ukraine for example, for banning Russian TV. Now this is like a commonly accepted approach in Europe, that Russian TV is banned because it's considered to be not media, but proxy media or disinformation source. We see how now many governments trying to limit the influence of social media or to increase the responsibility of social media for the content which they are spreading. There are a lot of attempts to sign some kind of principle documents about television, about radio, about the responsibility of them for spreading the information. But do you see some kind of working trends? What could really work against Russian propaganda, against China propaganda? What really could be a path to make this instrument non-effective?
Yeah, I mean, education, I feel like that's the key. I like to bring up Finland. Well, it's my home country, but it's also a good example of how do things well. In Finland, we start talking about disinformation already in preschool, for example. So it's done by telling fairy tales, how lying is bad, what are the effects of lying. And this kind of education process, it already starts in primary school and it goes through the whole education system. So media literacy is probably the closest term for that. So like which sources you should rely, what kind of journalism is good, how to be skeptical about information. I feel like people need to be better informed about the presence of disinformation and propaganda, and still people should make up their own minds. But it should be done in an educated way so that you know how these systems work, how countries spread propaganda, for example. What are the basic techniques of spreading propaganda, like fire hose of falsehood coming from Russia? And this needs to be tightly integrated into the education system. That's my view.
Before the full invasion started last year, we also observed quite intense Russian propaganda of the hatred, of not only the hatred, but the war among Russian population inside Russia. And that was one of the signs that the real war is coming. Can we say that we In information space, we can observe, and in information space, we can identify the future conflicts. Is there any researches which are done in this direction?
Probably there is. I'm not aware. That's not really my field, but probably there are. I mean, this kind of thinking could be, for example, AI could be probably used. So it would be probability calculation, statistics, basically. But I mean, it could be doable, and it would be so. For example, you could calculate the probability of a conflict in the next 10 years in a country by analyzing the media content, analyzing history, this kind of stuff. So be kind of this system where you just feed enough information so that you can make sophisticated estimates on probability of a conflict, for example. And it would detect drastic changes in the information space. So, for example, we know that Russia started pushing propaganda, anti-Ukrainian propaganda, a long time before even the 2014 events. So it's something that it could be done, but I'm probably not the person to say how it should be done, but I feel like there would be need for this kind of systems for sure.
Okay, and probably the last set of questions here. Warfare, informational warfare. Is this like already we're inside of it, or what will future war look like? Would it be a mainly informational one, or we still are in conventional world and the information is just like a 10% of our existence?
I wouldn't talk about percentages. It's very difficult to estimate it that way. But I feel like information warfare is one part of this hybrid warfare thinking, and it should always be taken into account. So let's take an example. If Russian propaganda would have been more effective, the military and humanitarian aid that Ukraine has received so that it can defend itself could be reduced. That would be direct effect on this. Or world leaders could be persuaded to call for peace negotiations, for example. And some countries like the United States, they still have leverage, even though we can talk about sovereign countries, but they have leverage. We shouldn't deny it, or European countries also much less, but still have leverage. But yeah, this information warfare can be extremely effective in both starting wars, ending wars, having truces, this kind of stuff. But also it can have very concrete effect in military aid, for example. So what equipment is sent to help Ukraine defend itself? So, for example, we know already that in Germany, the political party, far-right party AfD, they started a strong campaign to fight against sending the Leopard tanks. And now, from Der Spiegel investigation, we know that this was funded by Russian money. It was a Russian spy who was sending them money and giving them legal help to do this. So that's hybrid warfare, information warfare in action. And it's not, of course, we don't know if it stalled the delivery of Leopard tanks. Now they are there, that's good, but still these can have actual outcomes in the war. So we just have to take this information warfare into account. It's a very important part of the war.
You already gave one advice to our audience, like to leave the social media and to go to your family. What else you can advise on in protecting yourself from the propaganda influence, from disinformation influence? What practical steps?
Give news some time. Don't make quick decisions based on something that's like breaking news stuff. Let news evolve a little bit and things clear up. I think a perfect example is the hospital strike, or alleged hospital strike that apparently hit parking lot in Palestine, this kind of stuff. So it evolved extremely quickly. And then when people actually looked into the matter, it turned out to be probably something else. So it's a perfect example how we should give things a little bit more time. We live in this society where everything is imminent. We have to quickly get into this news and kind of make our own mind about them. But I don't think that's a very healthy approach, because things are more complex usually than they at first seem. Yeah, I would still like to emphasize go to nature, spend time with your friends and family, because social media shouldn't be your life. It shouldn't be the main focus of your life. And you have some real human interactions with emotions and nonverbal communication. It's just, we lose so much of communication when we are online. It's just this simplified model of interaction, in my view. So I have this kind of humane approach to this. But yeah, those two things are usually the ones that I emphasize.
I think it's perfect end of our conversation because now we can recommend to everyone to listen to this podcast and to go in park and to family and to have some live communication with the people around. Thank you so much. Thank you for work you're doing. I'm continue to be your listener and subscriber, and it's very interesting. And I do stimulate all other researchers to go public, to disclosure this information and influence networks, because it's really something which people need to see the truth, because the truth still exists. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Just to remind you that it was a Safe and Safe Country podcast, and I'm its host, Alina Frolova. This podcast is a joint project of Center for Defense Strategies, Ukrainska Pravda, and Media Center Ukraine. And you can find us on the biggest podcast platforms, Apple, Google, Spotify, SoundCloud, and of course at resources of Ukrainska Pravda. Safe and Safe Country. It depends on each of us how soon the world unsafe will disappear.